Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I do appreciate it. Just to remind you of the interview I did on Monday, we covered a lot of things with Bonnie Tunya on CNBC Africa. They were very quick to send me the link, so that's on the front of Rich Wrap-Ups. We covered the shilling, East Africa, Safaricom hitting a record, as has the all-share. It hit a record Thursday, it hit a record Friday, and it hit a record yesterday. So it's coming into today on a winning sequence of 3 sessions. Frank Matzart was a great guest on Mindspeak and created a great conversation actually online about a number of things. We're editing that footage, and we will also be uploading his presentation. Home Thoughts, I like this tweet, and it's of a photograph of a beach scene and a fire, a bonfire, where I'd rather be. That was from Idil Yoner, and I liked it, and it made me think of being down for Christmas and New Year in Diani. Rainer Maria Rilke, I want to be with those who know secret things, or else alone. The work of the eyes is done. Go now and do the heart work on the images imprisoned within you. Like most of the others, this is Hunter S. Thompson now, I was a seeker, a mover, a malcontent, and at times a stupid hellraiser. I was never idle long enough to do much thinking, but I felt somehow that my instincts were right. I shared a vagrant optimism that some of us were making real progress, that we had taken an honest road, and that the best of us would inevitably make it over the top. At the same time, I shared a dark suspicion that the life we were leading was a lost cause, that we were all actors kidding ourselves along on a senseless odyssey. It was the tension between these two poles, a restless idealism on one hand and a sense of impending doom on the other, that kept me going. Put up a photograph of Hunter S. Thompson. Political reflections, and there are a few today. Ascendant China cited by US panel as Pentagon pivots to Asia. China's advancing military capabilities will challenge the US's ability to deter conflicts, defend partners, and maintain freedom of the seas and airways in the Asia-Pacific region, according to a commission mandated by Congress. While the United States currently has the world's most capable Navy, its surface firepower is concentrated in aircraft carrier task forces, the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission said in its annual report. China is pursuing a missile-centric strategy with the purpose of holding U.S. aircraft carriers at high risk if they operate in China's near seas, and thereby hinder their access to those waters in the event of a crisis. Given China's growing navy and U.S. Navy's planned decline in the size of its fleet, the balance of power and presence in the region is shifting in China's direction. That will give China an increasing number of opportunities to provoke incidents at sea and in the air that could lead to a crisis or conflict. And saying, with a few exceptions, the US-China security relationship has deteriorated this year, as China also demonstrated increasingly bold and coercive actions towards its maritime neighbors, with turmoil in the East and South China seas. And then talking about the pivot to Asia, about which I've written about, the US global military strategy announced in January 2012, frequently described as the pivot to the Asia Pacific, is intended to position about 60% of the nation's naval assets in the region by 2020, up from about half today. The rebalancing includes plans to redeploy some military forces now stationed in Japan to Guam and rotate a contingent of Marines through Australia and probably also the Philippines. In point of fact, notwithstanding the recent alignment, particularly around the crashing oil price, I see an even more adversarial relationship going forward. However, there is a school of thought that this will not be the case, and I'll come to that in a moment. But on the 2nd of December 2013, I wrote a piece, "The Pivot to Asia Bears Its Fangs." And I said, then I see the pivot to Asia as the encirclement of China, then the shrinking of its operating theatre, and then lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery. And Xinjiang might well morph into China's Afghanistan. It seems to me that rulebook was shifted west to Ukraine, where this sort of Iron Curtain has been placed through Kiev. And Ukraine has been the periphery that got lit, interestingly enough. You will recall that the architect of Russia's defeat in Afghanistan was Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's this round two. And he remains a foreign policy eminence grise with the president's heir. I said then, the US probably feels it holds a decisive hard power advantage at this moment, and given the trajectory is one of gradual erosion of that decisive advantage, it leads me to the view that this pivot to Asia has a logic and momentum of its own. I said then, therefore I see the US being increasingly determined to press its advantage. One might even posit that calming down the Iranian front allows the US to better concentrate its energies on the pivot to Asia. One of the key elements of the pivot to Asia is the air-sea battle concept. This concept envisages the battle beginning with a blinding attack against Chinese anti-access facilities. And part of the pivot incorporates the distant blockade operations, and that, I think, is really what the pivot to Asia is about. It's about the ability to enforce a blockade. Yeah, I mean, I don't think a blinding attack is feasible. US sanctions aimed at changing power in Russia, says the Deputy Minister. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister accused the United States on Monday of trying to bring down President Putin by imposing sanctions on Moscow over the crisis in Ukraine. It is hardly a secret that the goal of the sanctions is to create social and economic conditions to carry out a change of power in Russia. And, I think that is one of the side effects, or not a side effect, or a desired effect of what is a very 21st century shock and awe without even firing a bullet. I call it oil and currency warfare. And I said the meeting, this was not too long ago, the meeting in Vienna merely confirmed that the US has wrestled control of the oil markets. President Obama, while getting creamed in the midterms, has been a very subtle, skilled, hard-nosed exponent of currency and now oil warfare. This plan to undercut oil was exquisitely constructed and executed. The ruble has been crushed. The Russian central bank has dropped $100 billion defending the currency. Then I moved on to Iran. Might have got an extension, but the new oil price normal keeps them right on the ropes. Then I mentioned Venezuela as well. Saudi Arabia apparently are holding 135 terrorism suspects in a nationwide sweep. Daesh and other extremist groups seem to be more successful at infiltrating Saudi Arabia and recruiting Saudi Arabians. This is Paul Sullivan. And my concern is, I'm not convinced that Saudi Arabia will be able to fend off the blowback, which might well light the tinderbox. I came across an interesting tweet by the Lemnis Cat. ISIS commander Omar al-Shishani served in the US, trained intelligence units in Georgia's 2008 war. Put up a photograph, and that was tweeted, and you can decide for yourself. The Spectator has an interesting article about Mecca and calls it the greatest paradox of the Islamic world. Home to the Kaaba, it is the lodestar to which 1.6 billion Muslims direct their 5 daily prayers, the single point on the planet around which Muslims revolve, quite literally for those able to perform the once grueling, now simply expensive pilgrimage to Hajj. And basically this is an article criticizing what the Saudis have done to this facility. One does not need to be a historian to wince at their desecration of Mecca's built environment, sites of immeasurable historical interest and significance, such as the Bilal Mosque, which dates to the Prophet's time, have been bulldozed in recent decades. The house belonging to Muhammad's most revered wife Khadija is now a public lavatory, an apt symbol of the Saudi regime. And I found a photograph of the Masjid al-Haram from the 1800s, and then I found another image on CNN. Mecca has changed dramatically over the past decades. This is how it appears in 2012. The Grand Mosque in the foreground is dwarfed by the Abraj Al Bayt Towers complex, including the Royal Mecca Clock Tower. One UK-based Saudi historian says what Saudi authorities are doing in Mecca amounts to cultural vandalism. I then came across some tremendous photographs on Agence France Presse photograph, Les Chrétiens d'Irak, these Fouan au Kurdistan, and have a look at this photograph. It's of Christians awaiting IS. Second photograph is of Alep, which is Aleppo. Another one of Aleppo, des enfants blessés ou morts est souvent une décision difficile. It's tragic what's happened in Syria, it really is. I like this photograph from Ian Bremer, young Xi Ping with his father. And this photograph, skating in front of the Forbidden City, Beijing, 1957, by Mark Ribou. And the point I was making about this other school of thought which sees China and US becoming less adversarial, more collaborative. Have a look at this article in The Guardian. Forget the BRICS. America and China will reshape the new world order. You know, that might also happen. There's a chance of that. Euro 123.16, dollar index 89.13, Japanese yen 120.12. The yen has fallen 16% against the dollar since the end of June. The finance minister said last month currency's plunge has been too fast. Swiss franc 0.9760, pound 156.44, the Aussie 0.8240, longest losing streak since it was floated in 1983. A gauge of business sentiment fell to the lowest since last year's election. It's down 3.6% over the last 9 sessions. India rupee 61.87, South Korean won 11.0867, Rial 260.03, and that fell to 261.74, which was the weakest intraday level since April 2005. The dollar's carrying all before it. Egyptian pound, incredibly and unchanged at 17.1454, but bear in mind the black market rate is a bit higher. Got a little bit softer on the black market yesterday. South African rand 11.5573. I said 12 in 2015. That could happen in 2040. The Aussie dollar has slumped 5.2% in the past 3 months, and I think, more than anything, it signals to us that all is not necessarily very robust in China. US dollars rallied 7.1% over the same period. Dollar index, I'll put up a 3-month chart. I think it's headed to 100 in 2015. Wall Street Journal reported that some Fed officials were saying they were seriously considering dropping an assurance that short-term interest rates will stay near zero for a considerable time. My point is, you get one very big employment number and that pledge goes out the window. Euro dollar 123.16. I'm looking for parity in 2015. I was reading an article in Counterpunch, and they said a second destabilizing impact from falling oil prices will be to contribute toward general deflation in Europe and Japan. And that took me back to some points I was making at the end of September when I said, in my opinion, any nascent recovery in Europe was nipped in the bud because of Ukraine-related contagion, but also that inflation in the Eurozone, which has its nose barely above zero at 0.4%, now 0.3%, could go negative in the next 12 months, and I think stay there for a while. The second largest producer in OPEC, which is Iraq, reduced its Basra light crude to the lowest in at least 11 years, a price list for January showed. And this was the point I was making before. It's cutthroat out there, Darwinian. Oil prices will stay around the current level of $65 for 6 or 7 months. I think that's a given. And I wrote about this on the 13th of October. when I said the conditions are optimal for a complete washout. A blow-off bottom was a more earthy description in my time, down as far as $50 a barrel. I said then markets overshoot, crude oil does it big time, and any and every model needs to consider such a price outcome. Well, have a look at this 1 month chart. We're now at $60.34 on WTI. Brent closed at its lowest since October 2009 and was at $65.76. Having closed yesterday at $66.19. And just to go back to some points I made, it is the US, in my opinion, not Saudi Arabia, that is the new price setter for the oil markets, and this is a deep and important geopolitical development. And I said that on the 13th of October. And I said then the new price levels will have immediate enormous geopolitical and financial knock-on effects, and oh my goodness, it's extraordinary. Crude oil, I'll put up a 1-year chart. You can see what a complete collapse it has been. And as I said on the 1st of December, the meeting in Vienna merely confirmed that the US has wrestled control of the oil markets. And, you know, Obama, whilst he got creamed in the midterms, he has been a very subtle, skilled, hard-nosed exponent of currency and now oil warfare. The plan to undercut oil was exquisitely constructed and executed. Russian ruble is being crushed. They dropped $100 billion. Interesting article in the Sydney Morning Herald about oil wars, and they're looking at it from the angle of Saudi Arabia, saying Saudi Arabia makes enemies as prices tumble. It really is a $60 question. Oil prices are going through the floor, and there is no sense yet of what the new petro-normal might be. Saudi Arabia is punting that the market will stabilize at about $60 a barrel. They say Riyadh is the only global oil producer with the capacity to turn on or off the spigots that match supply and demand, and can hence vary the price up or down. It doesn't require great analytical stretch to conclude that despite their reluctance to take a conventional military role in Middle Eastern conflicts, the Saudi princes have opted for a ruthless oil war. There's no shortage of enemies: Tehran, Damascus, Moscow, even Riyadh's best ally, Washington. What we now have is a year-long game of chicken. The Saudis are waiting to see how much pain the major oil producers can take before they are willing to make meaningful cuts. Gold has its nose above 1200 at 1201.53. That compares to a recent low of 1130.40 on November the 7th, which was the lowest since 2010. I like this tweet from Ian Bremmer: Russian priest praying at central bank servers. As likely to stop, he says, the ruble's slide as anything else. Emerging market currencies have tumbled to a decade low on the dollar and oil. An index tracking 20 key exchange rates has fallen to levels last seen more than a decade ago, down 10.2% this year, and headed for the biggest annual slide since 2008. I'll put up an image of Russia's 10-year bond yield, which climbed for the 10th consecutive day to a new 5-year high of 12.4%. And this is a consequence of this geopolitical hot war that I've been talking about. And I'll put up an image of the Russian ruble, which seems to have stabilized a little of late. Let's go to Africa. Ebola cases in Sierra Leone now total 7,798 as of December the 6th, passing its West African neighbor Liberia, where the outbreak is stabilizing. Sierra Leone added 163 confirmed, probable, or suspected Ebola cases from DEX 3 to DEX 6 of the World Health Organization. And as I said previously, it's all about the speed of infections, the escape velocity, about which Paul Virilio spoke about before. Put up an image of the Ebola virus magnified. Very interesting piece in the Daily Maverick. Zimbabwe, a guide to Mugabe's new regime, saying that he's ever the genius political strategist, did not disappoint. By the conclusion of the party conference on Saturday, Zimbabwe's political landscape looked completely different. This is uncharted territory, says Piers Pigus, Southern African Director for the International Crisis Group. Over the last few years, the inner workings of ZANU-PF have been understood as a struggle between two main factions: the hardliners aligned with Justice Minister Emerson the Crocodile Mnangagwa, so nicknamed because of her reputation for ruthlessness and violence, and the more moderate faction under the Vice President Joyce Mujuru, which supposedly fought to keep the party true to its liberation struggle idealism. Both Mnangagwa and Mujuru harbored ambitions to take over from Mugabe. Only Mnangagwa is still in that race, and we know why. Mujuru was sort of excised from the party. And then they're saying, can the president keep his wife on the leash? And how will that play out as well? I'll put up a photograph of First Lady Grace Mugabe following proceedings during the last day of the ZANU-PF 6th People's Congress in Harare. Sudan is hungry for change, but who will take on Omar al-Bashir? On a balmy evening in Khartoum, waiters glided across a clipped, floodlit lawn to serve a well-heeled crowd canapes of chicken, salmon and shrimp. It was the opening night of a film festival, and after some turgid speeches, guests gathered under the stars to watch a biopic of Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese independence fighter who overthrew a brutal and despotic regime. For some Sudanese members of the audience, the story struck a chord. We did not have anyone like that who can inspire people and lead the opposition. People say, yes, the government is bad, but they don't see an alternative. This gives lifeblood to the ruling party. With someone like Lumumba, it would bring opposition parties together and inspire and encourage the young generation. Interesting piece in the Africa Report: can Angola's elite transform itself? I don't think so. Plus, they've been hit with a giant margin call, as they have in Nigeria, and things are going to get extremely messy. Italy's Matteo Renzi pivots to Africa for alternatives to Russian gas, it says in the FT. And he has. When I was in Maputo earlier this year, his plane was there as well. And this is what's interesting. In the future, he says, the energy question will increasingly be developed in a north-south direction. And so the relationship with African countries will be very important. And of course, Eni is heavily invested. And as I've said before, Mozambique could be the next Qatar. I'll put up an image of the Africa Rising conference that I visited, where Renzi's plane was parked as I landed Maputo from the sea. I love this photograph. South African all share up 7.2077% in 2014. Popped up a little bit yesterday, 0.17%. Dollar Rand 11.5573. My target is 12. Egyptian pound 7.154 versus the dollar officially. But in the unofficial market, the pound was trading at 7.68. One trader said weaker than Thursday's 7.65 to the dollar. The Egyptian stock market is up 41.212% year to date, and just 234 points below a more than 6-year high reached on September the 30th of this year. The Nigerian all-share fell 0.46%. It's down 19.971%, and at 22-month lows. The overnight rate hit 70%, more than doubling. Banks are scrambling for funds to cover their positions. I think the currency heads to 200. To keep the overnight rate at 70 is not sustainable. I called it the Lamont move, which I said they'd do, but it's not going to last. And I've written about this on the 10th of November when I said the markets in Nigeria are getting waggadooed by the collapse in the price of oil, and that Nigeria is in the eye of the storm. 200. And I can hear the echo, what went wrong? Because they only just rebased. But the big game changer for Nigeria has been the free fall in the price of crude oil. Ghana Stock Exchange is up 7.505% in 2014. Kenya, there's this report that's come out, and it's linked under Kenya on Rich Wrap-Ups. Kenya's death squads. This is Al Jazeera. Kenya's counter-terrorism police confess to extrajudicial killings. Watch it and make up your own mind. Prima facie evidence to suggest Britain and Israel involved, and talking about estimates of 500 assassinations in a year. One of those who was assassinated was Abu Bakr Sharif alias Makaburi, who was interviewed a lot before his assassination and actually predicted it. I'll put up an image of him, one of Mombasa riots, another one of Abu Drogo, who was also assassinated. And I've said, what worries me about this kind of what is a wholesale assassination policy, clearly, is that, what appear like uncorrelated spikes, paroxysms of violence in different parts of the country conflate, become more broad-based and amplified. And I think that's what the Al-Shabaab is counting on. Put up an image of Westgate. I asked in September, are we headed into a new Waziristan-type normal? And I also wrote saying that, insecurity is our Achilles heel. The markets, interestingly, had looked through all of this and continued to look through all of this. The all shares up more than 156% over 3 years and has hit record highs the last 3 days in a row. Kenya shilling last trading at 90.445, considerably outperforming its peers. Nairobi all shares up 22.605% in 2014, and as I said, has set 3 consecutive record highs through this morning. I wrote over the weekend, Safaricom's move to pipe 4G into homes is now set to spike data spending big, and the price is set to slice through 15 as early as next week. I was saying that the EABL and Safaricom were essentially what had lifted the stock market. Safaricom closed yesterday at a fresh record of 15. It's now up 42.58% through this morning. If you didn't watch my interview with Bob Collymore, where I was really quite taken by the strength of those results, and I realized then that there was going to be this tremendous price reaction that's rallied about 20% since then. I went to attend something on Saturday where Bob said Kenya is made by the people, not the landscapes, and I rather like the photograph I took. I'll put that up again. EABL has rallied 14.4336% over the last 4 weeks, and that's also lifted the all share. It's been a key precipitator of the bull move at the Nairobi all share. The NSE 20 has lagged the all share. It's up 5.42% this year. Treasury Secretary Henry Rotich said the government had reduced the cash to be borrowed through treasury bills and bonds to as low as 120 billion. That's the signal for sharply low interest rates, which we've been waiting for a while. Those sharply low interest rates plus a much sharply lower crude oil price support the economy with a good-sized stimulus in the arm.